The space that I have chose to analyze is the food court in QUT, and the reason I chose to do this space is that it's one of my favorite places. It's the place that I most frequently visit. Introduction. So in my presentation, I have divided it into two parts. Part 1 is my observations of the space, and part 2 is my recommendations. What I think I can alter in this space to make it more friendly to visit and to make it more appealing for people to visit. The concepts that I'm going to focus my presentation on is wayfinding, personal space, territories, and crowding, and sensory stimulation. I'm also going to talk about people's behavior in the spaces and different individuals' behavior in the spaces as well. So my observations were done on a Monday and a Thursday between that lunch hour timing, between 1 and 2 and 12 and 1. I also did a observation between 4:15 and 5 o'clock, as I wanted to see, as the day progresses, do people's behavior change in the space. I also decided against doing observations on weekends, as the university was quiet on weekends, and since there was no classes on weekends, I thought that it would be pointless doing an observation, as there would be hardly any people visiting the space. Wayfinding. Wayfinding is used to help people navigate themselves towards the space, as well as it helps people navigate themselves when they're in the space. Now, I use wayfinding to help me navigate myself through the space, and it was very helpful to see that around the whole QUT campus, no matter where I went and no matter what sign was there, on the bottom or on some part of the sign, there was a little indication of the food court sign, which helped make my navigation towards the food court much easier. And as I made myself closer and closer to the food court, as I got closer and closer to the food court, my sensory stimulation kind of took over, and that olfactory senses started to get the smell of the food court, which was kind of a wayfinding tool in itself, the olfactory senses. Now, once I reached the food court, there was no real sign to show me the entrance or the exit. It was kind of a preempted decision to see an opening and just walk through. There was no real uniformity to go into the space. And once I was in this space, I also noticed that to exit the space, there was no real direction to exit the space from. It was kind of that once you're in the space, you can exit from any side of the area. Wayfinding in the space. So I noticed that when I was at this space, at the different counters of the space, there were not really signs on some of them, but on some of them there were signs to show me that this space is to ordering, and then that space is to pay. So that kind of helped with uniformity. But when there were the shops that did not have those signs to show me this is where to order, this is where to pay, they had these kind of barricades, as I've shown in one of the images. And these barricades helped keep the line in order, keep the line disciplined, so there's no chaos around the whole area. It helps keep things efficient, and it helps organize the space. As well as there were little indications with a cashier to show that this is where I pay, and there was a little sign on top that this is where to wait and pick up the order. So those were little wayfinding techniques I saw in each shop. And also around the space, I noticed that on the ceilings there were fire exits to show me where the fire exits were in case of a fire, and then there were signs to show me that here are the washrooms, this is the washrooms, that space is the washrooms. So there were kind of these little tools to help me identify each area of the space, and there were these little tools for like the barriers to help organize the space and reduce the chaos in the space. So for personal space, I noticed that in the space, when people were standing and waiting for the food, some of them felt intruded by people brushing past them as they walked through. And I noticed that when a couple of people walked through some of the users in the space that they got a bit fed up, and you could make out from their facial expression that they got a bit grumpy, if I may say, and they started to fold their hands, and they kind of started to open up their body to give their body more space. So that kind of showed that they were feeling their personal space being intruded by others, so they kind of folded their hands and made themselves bigger to kind of show people that this is my personal space, don't intrude, as well as it kind of links into territory, because there was one person who kept their bag down on the floor in front of them to kind of give them more personal space as well. With territory, I noticed that people alone behave different in the territory and mark the territory different when they were with somebody. So like in the first picture, the woman is sitting with her earphones on to kind of block out noise and to kind of give her that personal space, as well as she put the bag next to her on the chair and then put a laptop in front of her, kind of marking that territory, that don't come here, this is my personal space. And then if you see the next two images, you see that the two people talking, they have their bags on the table. So even though they were talking to each other, they kind of had their bags next to each other to kind of mark and show to the other person that this is my territory, this area is my territory. Even though I'm interacting with you, I still don't want you to come in my territory. And they marked it with their bag. As well as I noticed, and I was unable to document this, is that when a person went to order, they left their hat on the table to kind of mark their territory. And then when there was a person looking for a space to see, a place to sit, they saw that hat and they immediately just turned and walked in the other direction and tried to find another table. So that was another way people mark their territory. An interesting thing I noticed about territories is that on the image where there's the two women sitting in front of each other, I noticed that you could identify the closeness and they were okay with the other people kind of interfering in the territory, as they had their bags on the side, and when they were talking, they were kind of leaning into each other and talking, so it kind of showed that they were okay with the other person invading their territory, and it showed the relationship with the other person, that they had a good relationship. And in the other image where the two men were sitting, even though they were sitting on separate sides of the table, one man was sitting on the right of the table and one man was sitting on the left of the table, and this kind of showed that they were not very close, as they didn't even want to face each other when they were talking. They wanted to face each other at an angle, so it kind of showed the not so closeness as compared to the other image. Crowding is basically the reaction of a space when it becomes less available, and the reaction depends from space to space. Now in the food court, I noticed that crowding was affected by the height of the ceiling. I noticed that in that specific area of the food court where the ceiling was lowered, there were not windows and it was kind of a narrow passageway. I saw that the behavior and the facial expressions of the users in that space were a bit anxious and they looked a bit scared and nervous. And I noticed that was caused as I went and walked through that area of the space, because the walls were very narrow and it kind of felt like the walls were closing in on you. As well, the ceiling was very low, so it felt like the ceiling was compressing upon you and it felt very claustrophobic. And to add to that claustrophobic effect was the lights. The lights kind of came out of the ceiling, which pushed the height even lower. So it kind of felt like the ceiling was right above you. So it felt really claustrophobic and daunting. Sensory stimulation is the stimulation of your senses. Now in this space, I felt like the dominant senses were the sense of smell and the sense of sight. Now, an interesting thing is that when I was walking through the space, I noticed that these two senses helped define the space. As it was a food court, there were many counters around the whole area, and there was no real sitting area for each counter. It was all together. So I noticed that each shop had their own color scheme their own textures, their own materials they used to help you identify one shop from the other shop. So that was a really helpful way sight was used, as well as smell. As I was walking straight and I did a test that I only looked straight, I could still identify the food and the shop next to me, as smell helped me identify the cuisine, and it helped me navigate myself towards which cuisine I preferred. So it's kind of like, as I mentioned earlier, smell helped me navigate towards the food court. Smell inside the area helped me navigate to which restaurant I wanted to eat at. So those were the two senses that I found that were most stimulating in the area. Now, behavior and emotions in the space. What I found really intriguing was that the emotions that were displayed went kind of in a process-like motion. Is that when the people visited the space, they looked anxious, they were hungry, they wanted to get something to eat. And then when they were ordering and they're looking up at the menu and thinking, they looked like they were in stress, and they looked panicked, as they were very indecisive what they wanted to eat. And then after they ordered, they still were a bit anxious as they were waiting for their food. But once they got their food, the full emotion and the body language of the users changed. As I noticed that they appeared to be happy, they appeared to look happy. And then once they went and sat down and started eating their food, then that relaxation kicked in. So it was kind of like a process from one extreme emotion to another extreme emotion. Also, I noticed that different people reacted differently in the space, and that was dependent on their cultural background as well, as their eating habits were different from one cultural background to another cultural background, and their etiquettes were a bit different. As well as I noticed that backgrounds had a slight impact on preference of food. It didn't have a major impact because, in my opinion, food is something that depends on your mood. But it kind of had a impact in the sense that people of one background preferred to eat their familiar cuisine. Now, to conclude, the key points I analyzed were the wayfinding helped me identify the space through signs, and when I'm in the space, signs and my sensory stimulation helped me navigate myself through the space. Then personal space, territories, and crowding on different people had different effects, and on relationship between different people had different effects on the size of your space and territory. I also identified that sensory stimulation, for example, sight and smell, help define a space without having the physical barriers in place. Now, my recommendations for the space is that firstly, where the space got narrow, I recommend to put a glass wall to allow natural light to come in to make the space feel open and not enclosed. Another recommendation is to increase the height of the ceilings and recess the lights into the ceilings, as I believe the lights were sticking out, giving that feeling of the ceiling being even lower than it already was, hence recessing the lights back in and pushing the height of the ceiling higher so it doesn't feel like the ceiling is gonna close upon you, and it reduces that crowding effect of users feeling anxious and a bit daunted. Now, my third recommendation, I believe my most important recommendation, is adding greenery to the area. For example, where the TV wall is, change that into a green wall, and on different corners of the area add in potted plants. Now, plants are important as they help clear up the air from smell. So it gets quite intense, the area with smell, because there's a lot of cooking. So it helps clean up the air with smell, produce better air quality for the users. Plants also help control temperature. Plants also help reduce stress, as the green color evokes relaxation and hope. Also, the area can get quite noisy, and plants also help absorb the noise. So it'll be a very beneficial addition to the whole area.